flying a helicopter is always an exhilarating experience. The hum of the rotors, the panoramic views, and the sheer thrill of defying gravity combine to create a unique sensation every time I take to the skies. But nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed on a routine flight. It was a clear, crisp morning, and I was scheduled to transport some equipment to a remote research outpost nestled deep within the dense forests of Washington state. The early rays of the sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows and creating a mesmerizing patchwork of light and dark on the forest floor. I had flown this route dozens of times before, but that day, something felt different. The air was charged with an unexplainable energy, and a sense of anticipation hung over me like a shroud. I made my final pre-flight checks, ensuring everything was in order before takeoff. The hum of the engine grew louder, and soon I was airborne, ascending into the vast blue sky. As I reached cruising altitude, the forest below stretched out endlessly, a sea of green that seemed to go on forever. About 30 minutes into the flight, I noticed something unusual. There was a clearing in the forest, an area I hadn't seen before. Intrigued, I decided to descend slightly for a closer look. As I hovered above the clearing, I spotted a movement near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a bear, given the size and the way it moved. But as I watched more closely, my heart skipped a beat. Standing there, partially obscured by the foliage, was a massive humanoid figure covered in dark, matted hair. It must have been at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. The creature moved with a surprising grace for something so large, stepping cautiously into the clearing and glancing around as if ensuring it was alone. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Could this be the legendary Sasquatch? I had heard countless stories and seen grainy photographs, but I had always been skeptical. Yet here it was, right in front of me. I fumbled for my camera, my hand shaking with a mix of excitement and fear. As I snapped a few pictures, the creature suddenly looked up, its eyes locking onto my helicopter. For a moment, we stared at each other, and I felt a strange connection, as if it was aware of my presence and curious about my intentions. Then, with a fluid motion, it turned and disappeared back into the forest, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. My heart was pounding as I continued on my flight, my mind racing with what I had just witnessed. I knew that no one would believe me without evidence, and I couldn't wait to develop the photographs to prove that what I saw was real. Upon reaching the research outpost, I shared my experience with the scientists there. They were intrigued but cautious, knowing that many supposed Sasquatch sightings had been debunked over the years. Nonetheless, they were eager to see the photographs. As I developed the film later that day, my anticipation grew. However, when the images finally appeared, my heart sank. The photographs were blurry, the creature barely distinguishable from the surrounding foliage. It looked more like a shadow than a definitive proof of the creature's existence. Despite this, I knew what I had seen, and the memory of that encounter remained vivid in my mind. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my sighting had been more than just a coincidence. I began researching Sasquatch sightings and learned about the history and legends surrounding these elusive creatures. Many of the stories were similar to mine: fleeting glimpses, unexplained noises, and a sense of being watched in the deep woods. I decided to return to the clearing where I had seen the creature, hoping for another encounter. Armed with better equipment, including a high-resolution camera and a drone, I spent several days exploring the area, but the forest remained silent and devoid of any signs of the creature. Despite my best efforts, I never saw the Sasquatch again. However, the experience left a lasting impression on me. Fishing has always been my solace, a way to escape the bustle of everyday life. My favorite spot, Bear Lake, nestled in the Rocky Mountains, has a serene beauty that's unmatched. Its deep, crystal-clear waters are home to an abundance of fish, making it a haven for enthusiasts like me. But the lake holds more than just fish. It's wrapped in a legend that has intrigued me since childhood, the legend of the Bear Lake Monster. I arrived at Bear Lake early one misty morning in late August. The sky was a pale gray, the sun struggling to pierce through the thick fog that blanketed the water. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves against my boat and the distant calls of loons. As I paddled out to my favorite fishing spot, a chill ran down my spine. I shrugged it off as just the cold morning air. Reaching the middle of the lake, I set up my fishing gear, casting my line into the depths. Time seemed to stand still as I sat there, waiting for a bite, the tranquility of the lake seeping into my bones. I must have dozed off because I was startled awake by a violent tug on my line. My heart raced as I grabbed the rod, struggling to reel in whatever had taken the bait. It was unlike any fish I had ever encountered. The pull was powerful, almost supernatural. I braced myself, muscles straining, as the boat rocked precariously. Then, through the mist, I saw it, a massive dark shape moving beneath the surface. It was long, at least 20 feet, with a serpentine body that glided through the water with an eerie grace. My mind raced. Could this be the Bear Lake Monster, the creature of legends and nightmares? For a moment, fear paralyzed me. The stories I'd heard as a child about the monster flashed through my mind. Some said it had the head of a horse and the body of a snake, while others described it as a giant fish with terrifying jaws. But this was something else entirely. As the creature surfaced, my breath caught in my throat. Its head broke the water first, sleek and dark, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. It looked at me with an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. The rest of its body followed, revealing a muscular, serpentine form covered in iridescent scales that shimmered in the dim light. I watched in awe and terror as the monster circled my boat, its movements graceful yet predatory. It seemed to be studying me, deciding whether I was a threat or just another curiosity in its domain. I was too stunned to move, clutching my fishing rod like a lifeline. Suddenly, the creature dove, disappearing into the depths. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to process what I had just seen. Was it real, or had my mind conjured up a vision born from too many sleepless nights and childhood stories? But the water still rippled from where it had surfaced, a tangible proof that something extraordinary had occurred. I decided to head back to shore, my fishing forgotten. Paddling with all my might, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in the water made me jump, every ripple a reminder of what lurked beneath. When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed onto the pebbly beach, my body trembling. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The world needed to know that the legend of the Bear Lake Monster was real. But how would I convince anyone? I had no proof, just my word and the lingering fear in my gut. Back at the cabin, I scribbled down every detail of the encounter, my hands shaking. I described the monster's eyes, its scales, the sheer size of it. As I wrote, the terror began to morph into a strange sense of wonder. I had witnessed something incredible, something that defied explanation. The next day, armed with my notes, I headed into town to share my story. The local newspaper editor, a skeptical old man named Tom, listened patiently as I recounted my experience. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're not the first to claim they've seen the Bear Lake Monster," he said slowly. "But your account is the most detailed I've heard in years. If what you say is true, this could be the biggest news this town has ever seen." He agreed to publish my story, and within days, it became the talk of the town. people flocked to Bear Lake, hoping for a glimpse of the legendary creature. Scientists and cryptozoologists arrived, eager to study the lake and uncover its secrets. The once quiet spot became a hub of activity, a mixture of excitement and skepticism in the air. As for me, I found myself at the center of it all, the fisherman who had seen the impossible. Some called me a liar, others a hero. But deep down, I knew the truth. The Bear Lake monster was real, and I had been lucky, or perhaps unlucky, enough to encounter it. In the months that followed, the excitement gradually died down. No one else reported seeing the monster, and the scientific expeditions yielded no conclusive evidence. Bear Lake returned to its tranquil state, the legend fading back into obscurity. I had always been fascinated by the stories of creatures that roamed the lesser-known corners of the earth. My latest adventure had taken me to the island of Java, a place rich in culture and teeming with mysterious wildlife. I had read about the ahul, a legendary giant bat that was rumored to inhabit the dense jungles of this Indonesian island. According to the legends, this bat was enormous, boasting a wingspan of up to 12 feet, far larger than the Bismarck flying fox of New Guinea, which was previously considered one of the world's largest bats. As I journeyed deeper into the heart of Java, I was driven by the hope of catching a glimpse of this elusive creature. The locals were friendly but cautious when I asked about the ahul. Many believed in its existence, but their tales were always accompanied by warnings. "Be careful," they would say. "The ahul is not just a bat, it's a spirit of the jungle." Undeterred by these warnings, I set out with my guide, Arif, a knowledgeable and experienced tracker. He was skeptical about the ahul, but agreed to lead me into the jungle. "I have never seen it myself," he confessed as we trekked through the thick underbrush. "But I have heard its call. They say it sounds like ahul, and that's how it got its name." For days we navigated the dense foliage, following the sounds of the jungle. The nights were particularly eerie, with the cacophony of nocturnal animals and the occasional rustle that made my heart race. Despite the beauty of the surroundings, I could not shake off a sense of foreboding. One evening, as we made camp near a small river, I noticed Arif was unusually quiet. He stared into the fire, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He looked up at me, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Tonight feels different," he said. "I think we are close." The air was thick with anticipation as darkness enveloped the jungle. We sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the night. Suddenly, a piercing cry echoed through the trees. "Ahul! Ahul!" It was unmistakable, unlike anything I had ever heard. Arif and I exchanged glances, our excitement barely contained. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the ahul." We grabbed our gear and cautiously made our way towards the sound. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the trees and vines forming an almost impenetrable barrier. As we moved deeper, the calls grew louder, more frequent. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and exhilaration. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting an ethereal glow on the scene before us. And there it was, a shadowy figure perched high in the trees. It was enormous, far larger than any bat I had ever seen. Its wings were folded, but even in the dim light I could tell they were massive. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to believe my eyes. The ahul was real. Arif nudged me, snapping me out of my daze. "Get your camera," he whispered urgently. With shaking hands, I raised my camera and began to take pictures. The ahul shifted slightly, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. It was watching us, aware of our presence. The sense of awe I felt was indescribable. Here was a creature that defied all known biology, a true wonder of nature. Suddenly, with a powerful thrust of its wings, the Ahul took off into the night sky. The force of its takeoff sent a gust of wind through the clearing, nearly knocking me off my feet. I watched in amazement as it soared above the trees, its massive wings cutting through the air with silent grace. Arif and I stood there, speechless, as the Ahul disappeared into the distance. The jungle seemed to come alive again, the sounds of the night resuming their rhythm. I lowered my camera, my mind racing with thoughts. I had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change the way we understood the natural world. As we made our way back to camp, Arif broke the silence. "You were right," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "The Ahul is real." We returned to the village the next day, our story met with a mix of skepticism and wonder. I knew that my photographs would be scrutinized and many would doubt the authenticity of our encounter. But for me, it didn't matter. I had seen the Ahul with my own eyes, and that was enough. Jess and Graham had always loved the outdoors. They had tackled some of the most challenging hikes in the country, but the Appalachian Trail had always been their dream. Stretching over 2,090 miles from Georgia to Maine, it promised breathtaking views, diverse wildlife, and a sense of accomplishment they craved. They started their journey in early spring, when the air was crisp and the trees were just beginning to bud. The first few weeks were everything they had hoped for. They met fellow hikers, shared stories around campfires, and marveled at the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was on a misty morning in Virginia, near the town of Damascus, that things began to feel different. They had been on the trail for over a month, and their routine had become second nature. Wake up at dawn, pack up camp, hike until sundown, and then find a place to sleep. But this morning, there was an eerie stillness in the air. As they packed up their tent, Jess noticed a man standing a few yards away just watching them. He was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and piercing blue eyes. She nudged Graham, who glanced over and gave a polite nod to the stranger. The man didn't respond, just turned and walked back into the woods. "Probably just another hiker," Graham said, trying to reassure her. But Jess couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They continued their hike, but Jess couldn't stop thinking about the man. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see him following them. By midday, they reached a remote section of the trail, far from any roads or towns. The trees were dense, and the canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight. Suddenly, Jess heard a rustling in the bushes. She froze, heart pounding, as the man from the morning emerged onto the trail. This time he was closer, his eyes locked onto hers. Graham stepped in front of her, trying to put himself between her and the stranger. "Can we help you?" Graham asked, his voice steady but firm. The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, then another. Graham reached for the small knife he kept in his backpack, but before he could react, the man lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Jess screamed and tried to run, but the man grabbed her, pulling her into the trees. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. He dragged her deeper into the forest, away from the trail. Jess's mind raced. She had to stay calm, had to think of a way to escape. After what felt like hours, the man finally stopped. He tied her hands with rough rope and pushed her against a tree. Jess looked around, trying to find something she could use to free herself. But there was nothing. The forest was silent, except for the sound of her own ragged breathing. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He just sat down a few feet away, watching her with those cold blue eyes. Days passed in a blur. The man would disappear for hours at a time, leaving Jess alone in the woods. She tried to loosen the ropes, but they were too tight. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from her attempts to escape. One morning, she woke to find the man gone. She looked around, heart racing, and saw a sharp rock half buried in the dirt. With trembling hands, she managed to work the rock free and began sawing at the ropes. It took hours, but finally, she was free. She stumbled through the forest, trying to find her way back to the trail. Her legs were weak and she was dehydrated, but she kept moving. She had to find Graham. She had to get help. After what felt like an eternity, she heard voices. She followed the sound and emerged onto the trail where a group of hikers were setting up camp. They rushed to her side, offering water and blankets, and called for help. Jess led the authorities back to where she had been held, but the man was gone. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. Graham was found a few miles away, bruised but alive. They were taken to a hospital where they were reunited, grateful to be safe. The man was never caught, and the memory of those days in the woods haunted Jess for years. Halloween night always had a certain chill to it, but that particular year, it felt colder than usual. I had heard the stories about the old Victorian house on the edge of town, but I never believed them. It was said to be haunted, but in a small town like ours, ghost stories were as common as pumpkin patches in October. Dressed as a ghost myself, a white sheet draped over my head with 2 eye holes cut out, I joined my friends for a night of trick-or-treating. The streets were alive with kids in costumes, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. We had hit most of the neighborhood houses and were making our way towards the outskirts when someone suggested we visit the old Victorian house. "Come on, it's just a house," I said, trying to sound brave. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. We made our way down the long, winding path, flanked by overgrown bushes and trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. The house loomed ahead, its dark silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The front door creaked open with an eerie groan as we stepped onto the porch. We exchanged nervous glances, but no one wanted to back down. The interior was dark, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. Our footsteps echoed in the empty halls, each creak of the floorboards amplifying our fear. "Maybe we should go back," whispered Jenny, her voice trembling. "Just a little further," I urged, my own fear making my voice waver. We reached what appeared to be the living room, its grand fireplace cold and empty. Suddenly, a draft blew through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. We stood frozen, hearts pounding in the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, just an oppressive silence. Then we heard it. A faint, distant sobbing. It was coming from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I led the way, each step on the staircase echoing ominously. The sobbing grew louder as we approached a door at the end of the hallway. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Gathering my courage, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was bathed in an ethereal glow. A figure stood by the window, her back to us. She wore a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading down her back. The sobbing stopped as she turned to face us. Her eyes were empty, hollow voids that seemed to pierce through my soul. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like a cold breeze. We stood rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. The ghostly figure floated closer, her presence sending chills down my spine. "I can't leave," she said, her voice growing more desperate. "I'm trapped here." I didn't know what to say or do. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the reality of the ghost standing before us. She pointed to a dusty old diary on a nearby table. We nodded, too frightened to refuse. As soon as we picked up the diary, the ghostly figure began to fade. We didn't waste any time getting out of that house. Back in the safety of the streetlights, we opened the diary and read her tragic story, a tale of love, betrayal, and a broken heart that kept her spirit bound to the house. That Halloween night changed us. The ghost story haunted our dreams, but we felt a strange sense of peace knowing we had helped her find some semblance of closure. The old Victorian house, once a source of fear, became a reminder that not all ghosts are out to harm. Some are simply lost, looking for a way to move on. And every Halloween since, we made sure to leave a light on in that house, a silent tribute to the ghost we met on that fateful night.